The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. In those days, when there again was a great crowd without anything to eat, Jesus summoned the disciples and said, "My heart is moved with pity for the crowd, because they have been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will collapse on the way. And some of them have come a great distance." His disciples answered him, "Where can we get enough bread to satisfy them here in this deserted place?" Still he asked them, "How many loaves do you have?" They replied, 7. He ordered the crowd to sit down on the ground. Then taking the 7 loaves, he gave thanks, broke them, and gave them to the disciples to distribute. And they distributed them to the crowd. They also had a few fish. He said the blessing over them and ordered them distributed as also. They ate and were satisfied. They picked up the fragments left over, 7 baskets. There were about 4,000 people. He dismissed the crowd and got into the boat with his disciples and came into the region of Dalmutha. The Gospel of the Lord. Today's readings are about trusting in God. That Old Testament reading, Jeroboam did not trust in God, and the whole land was punished because of that. And then in our gospel, these 4,000 people, they trusted in Jesus, and he rewards them. I mean, they came to be fed spiritually, but he also fed them physically. That first reading is fascinating. A little background on it. Thursday, God tells King Solomon that the kingdom is going to be divided. So the kingdom of Israel that Saul and David worked hard to combine those 12 tribes of Israel into one nation, it's going to be divided because of Solomon's sin. What was his sin? He introduced pagan worship into Israel, and seriously, I mean all over, but even in Jerusalem, the hills near Jerusalem, one hill he had, there was a temple to Molech and another false god. Both of those gods required child sacrifice, and the Israelites were offering up their children in those temples right by Jerusalem. And another was to Ashtarte, a goddess of sexual pleasure and fertility. But it wasn't just there; it was over the whole country. And so, because of that great sin, said Israel's going to be divided. Okay, and then yesterday's reading, there's a prophet, Ahijah, that tells the labor boss, who's Jeroboam, that he's going to be king of this northern section of Israel, and of the 10 tribes. So there's 12 tribes. 2 will be in the southern kingdom, 10 in the northern kingdom. Well, then, since that reading has happened, is Solomon finds out about that, and he tries to kill Jeroboam, who, and the labor boss, flees to Egypt for safety. Then later, Solomon dies, and his son Rehoboam, young Rehoboam, becomes the new king. And one of the first issues that he has in his leadership role is the tradesmen that the labor boss was in charge of. They're tired of this really hard labor that Solomon put them under to build all those, not only the main temple, but all these other temples to false gods and stuff. And they want some relief. And they go in straight to the king and says, "We need relief." So the king goes in there and says, "Listen, if you think my father worked you hard, you haven't seen anything yet, because I'm really going to work you hard, because I have a lot of big plans." Well, the labor force rebels, and then the new king Solomon's son, runs back to Jerusalem for safety because they're going to kill him. Then the labor boss in Egypt hears about this. So he comes back to the northern tribes, and they make him king. So Jeroboam's the king of the northern tribes of Israel. But he's got a problem. And we heard in today's gospel, he can't go to Jerusalem and worship in the temple because Solomon's son Rehoboam will kill him. He doesn't like the idea of his people in the northern kingdom going down to Jerusalem south to worship in the temple there because he's afraid Rehoboam is going to convert them to come back and be a united nation again. So he decides to build his own temple. He builds two, one about 10 miles north of Jerusalem in Bethel, and then one about 125 miles north of that in a little city called Dan. And not only does he build these two temples, but he builds false gods to put in them, a golden calf, if you will, just like the Israelites with Moses did. While he went up to get the commandments, they built that golden calf. Well, he repeats that sin, and that's an abomination. And he takes anybody who wants to can be a priest, as opposed to the Levites. It was just one of the tribes could be priests there. And not only for the temples that were to God, but also to all these false gods. And so that was an abomination. And that kingdom of the northern kingdom lasts barely 200 years or so before the Assyrians take it over because of their false worship. They're not trusting in God, and they're trusting in all these fake gods. And you contrast that to today's gospel. Jesus takes 4,000 people into the desert for a retreat. Okay? They're hungry for the spiritual word. They're hungry for God's word in their hearts. And they don't have provisions. There's no chuck wagon that went with them. And so at the end of 3 days, Jesus takes pity on them. And he takes care of them. And he feeds them with just the miracle of the multiplication of the loaves and the fishes. And so that the history of that first reading is fascinating, really neat. But the main lesson there is we have to trust in God and not false idols. And we have plenty of false idols today, whether it's money, power, sex, politics. There's lots of false idols. We have to put our trust in God and have faith in him, and he'll protect us. He'll take care of us just like he took care of those 4,000 people in the desert.